Howdy, and welcome to the MrMaple Show. I'm Tim Nichols, and I appreciate you jumping in today. Make sure you subscribe. Today, I'm bringing you 5 mistakes that beginner Japanese maple collectors typically make. So, you may be asking, why am I an expert on what mistakes Japanese maple collectors make? Well, I am one. Matt and I, we started collecting Japanese maples really in the 90s when it was a lot more difficult to find a lot of these rare and interesting trees. And for us, we had a lot of learning through this process, and now we have a nursery where we deal with Japanese collectors every single day. And so not only are we collectors, but our business is all based on Japanese maple collectors. And so we see so many common mistakes, and that's why I really wanted to help you out with today with the 5 mistakes that beginning Japanese maple collectors typically make. Now we're just going to jump right into it with number 5. One of the mistakes that they typically make is buying a tree without doing the research first. On MrMaple, that's something that we really try to do our best to put a lot of good information out there for you, because it's really difficult to find good information on many of these rare cultivars that may not even be in the book on Japanese maples. So we often shoot videos, we often go through, write descriptions, and provide a lot of photos so you can do your own research to understand what this tree is going to do in your garden. It's real important to realize, does this tree grow in your area? Japanese maples typically grow in zones 5 through 9. So that's all the way down to a cold tolerance of negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Most coral bark selections, they're good zones 6 through 9, so they're good down to negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And we've even got some Acer pseudosubuldianum hybrids with Japanese maples that can go down to zone 4, which is negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So you want to make sure that you're choosing a selection that will grow in your gardening zone. And we're talking about that. That's the USDA hardiness zone. You can find that. We've got a full video on how to figure out what my USDA hardiness zone is. You can go to that video and check that out. But it's important to know, will my tree survive? The next thing is proper sitement in your garden. And you want to know, can this tree handle full sun in my garden? Can this tree handle full sun in a container? Because that can be rougher on a tree than being just in full sun in the garden. And you also have to think about, if you're growing this in a container or if you're putting this in the ground. If you're growing this in a container and you're putting it out on concrete, that's going to have residual heat and make it harder for you to grow these Japanese maples. So it's really important to give your Japanese maples room to grow. And I've got a real great tip for you in doing that. People always want to fill their garden out, and I get it. You want your garden to look great. You want your garden to always look immaculate. In an ideal situation, you plant your Japanese maple, and that is your focal point in the garden. Plant cheaper plants around your Japanese maple, so as your Japanese maple grows, you can remove those plants by cutting them down or digging them up and moving them to another location, that you don't have to worry about damaging your Japanese maple. Think about planting those cheaper plants in those areas to fill up those spaces while that Japanese maple is growing. Because Japanese maples do take a while to get, to their eventual size. On our website, we often talk about a 10-year size of Japanese maples. And there's lots of different information out there on different websites. Some people just copy other people's information. Some people use a term called mature or garden size. And those terms are a little misleading, because how old's your garden? How old is maturity? There's no real agreed upon age for that. Some people take it as the biggest one I've ever seen. And, that leads to old cultivars being much bigger than younger cultivars. And that's why we try to be the most truthful we can with a 10 to 15 year size, so you can really plan for your garden how tall and how wide these Japanese maples will get. And with Japanese maples, it's great because there's so much variety, and you can really choose so many different selections that can fit in your garden. So you don't have to choose a giant for a small space. You can choose a small Japanese maple for a small space. And if you're looking for that specimen that's going to get large, you can choose a larger growing selection. So there's a lot of selections out there, which is one of my favorite things about collecting Japanese maples. But just do your planning ahead of time, because we often see gardens that are planted too closely. And what ends up happening is a lot of those Japanese maples either have to be dug up or removed. And it's much more stressful removing and digging up a Japanese maple and moving that to a new location than it is a cheaper plant. Now, we do have some videos on how to transplant a Japanese maple, if that is something that you have to do. But note that there's a certain time of the season and a certain way to do that. And it's always more stressful removing one of your favorite plants out of your garden and moving it to another location. So my number 4 mistake that beginner Japanese maple collectors often make is waiting for a larger Japanese maple to become available. Often they'll say, I don't want to buy a 1 gallon, I want to buy a larger tree. Well, let me just put some perspective for you. A 1 gallon tree is typically 2 years after graft. When we get all the way down to a 5 gallon, they're typically 5 to 6 years from graft. So we're really only talking the difference of about 3 years of growth between a 1 gallon and a 5 gallon. And when we're looking at those differences, it's really not a lot. And when you start to factor in that a tree may grow faster in the ground than it does in a container, that time frame can even shorten even more. Many Japanese maples are extremely rare. And so many of these selections are only available in 1 gallons. They often sell out in that smaller size before they ever get to a larger size. And one of the most beautiful things about Japanese maples is that Japanese maples are beautiful even in their smaller sizes. So you can really appreciate a 1 gallon, and if it's in a container or if it's in the ground, their unique traits, whether it's their leaves, whether it's how the shape they grow, and being able to enjoy and watch these trees grow. That's one of the things that I love the most about planting a younger tree, is being able to say, I got that tree when it was about 18 inches, about 2 foot tall, and then now look at this tree. Look at what it has done in this area. And that's something that I can always be proud of, and that's one of the things I love doing. There's some inherent benefits to starting with 1 gallon Japanese maples. One, they're going to be cheaper. They're going to be cheaper, and they're also going to be cheaper to ship to you. So that means that you can actually collect more Japanese maples if you're collecting smaller sizes. One, because they're going to be cheaper, so financially you're going to be able to afford it more. But two, there's going to be more selection and more variety available in those 1 gallon sizes. So what I recommend doing is not waiting for a larger size. I recommend when you see a cultivar that you want, there's nothing wrong with getting a larger size to get that more immediate impact. But if you see a cultivar you want, get it now. Don't wait. And get that tree in the ground and let it start growing and developing into the tree that you can really learn to appreciate and be proud of seeing how this tree develops. One of the best things about Japanese maples is they grow in value with age. And not only will it add value to the landscape, but it's one of those trees that you can really enjoy watching it just develop and go through the seasons and see how this younger tree started out as a 1 gallon and now 15 years later it's this beautiful large specimen in your garden. My number 3 mistake that beginner Japanese maple collectors make is getting caught a little too much in the shape of the Japanese maple they purchased. We talked earlier about a 1 gallon is typically 2 years from graft. And then we talked about a 5 gallon could be 5 to 6 years from graft. That is still relatively young in the age of the Japanese maple. When we were in Japan, we got to go see the national treasure. And it's Naka Kamado weeping. And it's a tree that by some accounts is 400 years old, by other accounts it's 600 years old. And when you look at a tree that's, even that 5 gallon size is 5 to 6 years old, it's got a long life to live to get to, what could be hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's just a drop in the bucket of what this tree will actually develop into. And everybody has their own vision on growing a Japanese maple. I'll have some people who want a multi-branch traditional style Japanese maple for an upright. So if they got a blood good or an Emperor 1, they'll want a multi-stem tree that breaks very early and comes up and will have a very more spreading out canopy with branches down low. While other people may want to have a Japanese maple that is more of what we call a American street tree style, with one central branch that goes out and then eventually breaks into other branches. Neither one of these ways is wrong, but everybody has a different vision. And that's one of the great things about Japanese maples is you can train and shape them to whatever shape that you desire. So when you see a young tree, it's awesome looking at that tree and seeing what its characteristics are, doing that research and understanding what the natural shape is, but then going in and then pruning and accentuating that, or turning it and developing it into the vision that you have for it. And that's one of the great things about young Japanese maples, is that you can actually, its story isn't over when it's a young tree. You can put your own vision and your will and your artistic design behind this tree to develop it into, the piece of living art that's in your garden. So that's something that's really cool about these young trees, is they're very malleable, easy to work with. We've got a whole video on how to prune a Japanese maple. You should check out if you're looking at how should I prune my Japanese maple and train and shape it. And that sort of gives you some beginning ideas on how to do this. We've actually got a couple videos on how to prune, so you can go check out those. There's one on how to prune a core bark if that's the type of tree that you're growing. So we're going to be doing more and more of those pruning style videos as that time of the season approaches. And do check out those videos because there are wrong times of the video to prune your Japanese maples. Now, my number 2 mistake that beginner Japanese maple collectors often make, sometimes it's something that even more advanced collectors make as well, is using the wrong and incorrect fertilizers when fertilizing your Japanese maple. Now, we've got whole videos that go on for 45 minutes to an hour talking about how should I fertilize my Japanese maple. You can go check those out for more in-depth detail. But first, why are you fertilizing your Japanese maple? Fertilizer promotes growth. It promotes it to grow. So if you've got a tree out there that you're not wanting to grow, that's already getting tighter in its space, fertilizing is only going to, exacerbate the growth and make it grow faster and fill up that space quicker. So keep that in mind. But you need to look and see, when am I fertilizing? Am I fertilizing when I get the tree? Because this tree's probably already got fertilizer if it's coming from a nursery. That's something that beginner Japanese maple collectors make all the time. It's a mistake that, these trees have already been fertilized for the season if you're receiving them from a nursery. You're going to wait until the next season, and you're going to have to wait until the very next spring. When the tree is leafing out, that's really the best time to fertilize the Japanese maple, and you don't want to fertilize it going into fall. But let's get into the incorrect fertilizers. Too much fertilizer can cause a host of bad problems. We're talking about it'll stretch out the tree. And you're like, that's good growth. It stretches out the cambium too, and that's the thing that takes the nutrients and the water from the roots to the top and the tips of the trees. That means if you have a drought, if you have a cold snap, that tree is going to get more damaged from being over-fertilized than other trees that have not been over-fertilized. So that's something to really keep in mind, is not only will you cause damage, but you can actually invite pests and disease into your tree too from over-fertilizing. J.D. Vertrees, who wrote the book on Japanese maples, he actually writes, don't use any fertilizers, because he sees the inherent problems of people over-fertilizing. And while I don't take that same approach, I want to make sure that we give good warnings on don't over-fertilize. And what do you mean by not over-fertilizing? Well, here we recommend giving Japanese maples something like 10-10-10. That gives a well-balanced approach to the roots and to the top of your tree without really getting that long stretched out growth where the cambiums really get stretched out. That is when all the problems start to happen. And so by giving the plant a 10-10-10 in the early spring, 1, it's fairly cheap and it's easy to use, but 2, it gives good growth. You're going to see growth happening from this type of fertilizer. Now, when I said incorrect fertilizers, there is the flip side of this too. Over-fertilizing, and then there's under-fertilizing and thinking you're actually fertilizing. What I mean by that, beginner Japanese maples often buy a fertilizer that is labeled as for Japanese maples. And while that seems like something, yes, you're going to put it on a Japanese maple, often this style of fertilizer that's listed for Japanese maples doesn't have much nutrients and much fertilizers in the actual fertilizer itself. It may be like a 4-3-3. And so what you're doing is you're paying a higher price because it has the name Japanese maple on it. But you're getting less in your actual growth of your Japanese maple because you're getting less nutrients in the bag as well. So keep in mind, often those bags of fertilizers that are labeled as for Japanese maples often are overpriced and underperform when it comes to growth. So that's a common mistake that beginner Japanese maples often make, and fertilizing correctly with that 10-10-10 is going to give you a fantastic amount of growth, and it's going to be very healthy for your Japanese maples when applied in the early spring at that correct time. And we're down to number one, our number one mistake that beginner Japanese maple collectors make. But first, make sure you're subscribed here to the MrMaple Show. We put out daily content and we do our best to help you grow Japanese maples and learn about these Japanese maples that you're so passionate about that we are as well. So make sure you're subscribed there and check us out on your favorite podcast platform. We put out a weekly podcast and typically all about Japanese maples and gardening. I'm sure you'll love it. Now, what is the number one mistake for beginner Japanese maple collectors? If you've watched many of our videos, you probably know it already. We're going to talk about poor drainage. And this is the number one mistake that beginner Japanese maple collectors make, but it's also the number one thing that can kill your Japanese maple. So it's extremely, extremely important to make sure that you have good drainage. Poor drainage starts often with collectors in containers. If you have a container where the actual pot has the hole clogged up, it's not going to drain. If you have that pot sitting on a deck where it's suctioned to the deck, it's not going to drain. We recommend using some pot feet to lift that up a little bit. Even broken paint stirrers slid underneath a pot will allow you to get enough drainage on concrete. If you're going to something like the ground, you may want to use maybe bricks hidden underneath the pot. Think about adding drainage as best you can to containers. One of the biggest mistakes that I see on containers is what we have termed the tray of death. If you've got that tray, when you water the plant, water the Japanese maple, and it drains through the pot to a tray of water. Often that tray of water is sitting right at the roots of the base of the tree. And on a Japanese maple, that can cause phytophthora root rot. That type of pot and that type of tray isn't designed for the health of a Japanese maple. It's often used in some indoor plants and some plants that can handle more wet feet conditions. So keep that in mind, that that tray of death will definitely kill your Japanese maple, especially if used long term. We always recommend removing that dish. We recommend removing the tree from that pot and placing it in another pot that has better drainage where the water is allowed to drain all the way through the pot. Now, we've talked a little bit about poor drainage in containers, but let's talk a little bit about poor drainage in the ground. Poor drainage in the ground basically means that when you dig the hole for your plant, you're going to plant in, and you pour some water in that hole, if you come back in, say, hour and a half, if that water hasn't drained out of that hole, you've definitely got poor drainage. Now, that's the extreme side of poor drainage. But if you're seeing an area in your garden that doesn't drain very well, that becomes a little marshy, there's really only a few things you can do for a Japanese maple. One, you can plant the Japanese maple in a container and have it raised up above in that area. So you could have it on bricks or different things around that area so it's not sitting in the water. But you can change your garden itself by adding ditches, by adding things to drain that water out to make that area better for Japanese maples in the future. And while you can change the ground, and while you could put a Japanese maple in a container raised up in that area, often the smartest thing is to use something in that area that can handle that wet feet condition, like a dwarf bald cypress or a dwarf dawn redwood. Something like a Sherman's Norlicus variegated dwarf adds some unique ornamental features. Awesome plants to add in those wetter places in the garden. Poor drainage also could be just simply overwatering. New collectors get so excited about Japanese maples that they may kill their Japanese maple with kindness. They may go out there every single morning and every single afternoon and water their tree and never let that tree properly drain and not let that soil dry out enough. And you can drown your roots of your Japanese maple by doing that. So I heavily recommend watering your Japanese maple, then letting it dry out. And then watering your Japanese maple, and then letting it dry out. And this could be in a container, this could be in the ground, but that's a common mistake that we see people make frequently. And this could be someone actually going out there and doing it by hand. This could be done on a timer system when you're overwatering your plant that way as well. So keep in mind, you always got to make sure that you've got excellent drainage for Japanese maples. Avoid many of these mistakes we've been talking about. You can grow your Japanese maples to have a beautiful shape and make a beautiful garden and really have your garden at its peak and its prime for you to really show off. I hope you've enjoyed today's video on 5 mistakes that beginner Japanese maple collectors make. These are mistakes that I've made. These are mistakes that I've seen many other people make. And I just wanted to share them with you, so hopefully you can learn from our mistakes and really enjoy Japanese maples and the beauty they bring. Take care, God bless, and have a great day.